dynamics, exciter, and equalizer. And if I bring up the ASIO meter here, you'll see when I turn this on, it gives a pretty good kick to the real-time performance of the system. So that's good because it'll help us understand how the number of processor cores affects the project where there is clearly a pretty significant real-time limitation. The third project I'm using for these tests is exactly the same as the first, with the exception that all of the instruments are running on the same computer. I'm still using the exact same number of duplicate libraries across the string lines, the woodwind lines, and the brass lines. The difference is they're now all streaming from one computer, and they're all connected via one instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro that is running on the same machine as the DAW. The way I counted the number of audio dropouts was I loaded up the real-time performance meter in Cubase along with a handy little mouse click counter app. And what happens is every time you get an audio dropout, even if you can't hear it, the indicator turns red in the ASIO meter. So that tells you that the DAW couldn't keep up with the audio stream that's going out to the sound card and to your speakers. And so it turns red, and what you can do is you can click on it so it clears it out and goes back to its normal state. And then the next time a dropout occurs, it turns red again. So what happens is you play through the track and you click on that indicator to clear it out each time, and the mouse click counter keeps track of how many times you've done that. So I do that 3 times through the track, and at the end I have an indication of the total number of dropouts after those 3 times through the track, and I can calculate an average number of dropouts per minute of playback. Here are the measurements for the hybrid orchestral project in the master and slave configuration. And let me take a second to explain what you're looking at on these plots. So along the horizontal axis here are the buffer sizes that I tested, 48, 64, 96, 128, and 256. And for each of those buffer sizes, there are 6 vertical bars here. And those vertical bars represent the average number of dropouts per minute for the different number of cores that I tested, so 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 14. And what I did on these plots is I capped them at 30 dropouts per minute, because if you're getting more than 30 dropouts per minute, you're not going to run the project at that buffer size anyway. It's an unworkable number of dropouts. In fact, even 2 or 3 dropouts a minute, depending on how severe they are, can be unworkable as well. So I capped the plot at 30. The truth is, for the 48 buffer size, there were many hundreds of dropouts per minute. But whether it's 30 or 200 doesn't make a difference. You're not going to run the project at that buffer size. For 64, they did come down into the range of around 10 to maybe 20. And there was definitely a dependence on number of cores. So as the number of cores increased, in general, the number of dropouts did decrease. However, the dropouts were still severe enough that you're still not going to run the project at the 64 buffer size. So the difference between 4 cores and 12 cores and 14 cores actually doesn't matter, because even at 12 or 14 cores, it's still not good enough to make it a workable project. By the time you got to a 96 buffer size, however, the number of dropouts did drop down to a manageable level. They're still obvious, they're still a little bit difficult to work with, but in a pinch you could certainly make it work. And then at the 128 and 256 buffer sizes, absolutely no issues working with those 2 buffer sizes, even all the way down to 4 cores. So once you got up to a buffer size of 128 or 256, whether you were running 4 cores or 14 cores didn't make any difference. The project ran just fine regardless of that core count.
Yeah.
For the pop EDM track, the results look significantly different. So at both the 48 and 64 buffer sizes, the number of dropouts per minute were so large that you wouldn't run the project at that setting. By the time you got to 96, the situation did improve a little bit, and in fact, at the 4, 6, or 8 core count, the project was pretty much unusable, but you could kind of get by with it at 12 or 14, still certainly less than ideal. But again, in a pinch, you could probably make it work at those higher core counts at the 96 buffer size. But at the 128 or 256 buffer size, again, no issues whatsoever, whether you're running 4 cores or 14 cores. The hybrid orchestral track run from a single machine is definitely the most stressing of the 3 projects tested here, and that's reflected in these measurements. At 48, 64, or 96 buffer size, the number of dropouts totals in the many hundreds per minute, and you'd never run the project at any of those buffer sizes regardless of number of cores. So 4 cores versus 14 cores didn't make any difference. Now when you got to 128, things got interesting because there was some indication of a practical advantage to higher core counts. At the 4 and 6 core measurements, you see many hundreds of dropouts per minute, but by the time you got to 8, there was a significant decrease. So you came out of the range of absolutely unusable and into the range where, okay, maybe things are starting to be workable. And then the advantage from 8 to 10 is a little bit, but from 10 to 12 to 14, there's essentially no difference. And even from 8 to 10, the difference is measurable, but from a practical standpoint, you're still getting a decent number of dropouts. You'd still notice them. There's some chance it could impact your workflow. So the reality is that you'd just bump the buffer size up to 256 anyway, at which point there's really no advantage to anything more than 6 cores. Okay, so those are all the measurements, and they're important because they help you to quantify what's better. But as I said at the beginning of this video, what I'm really interested in determining is what is good enough. And the way I'm making that determination is by evaluating what I can actually perceive. So while the ASIO indicator might show a missed buffer transfer, quite often that miss is so small that you can't hear it. And that's what the information on this chart reflects. So I've categorized each of the tests in terms of whether or not the dropouts were perceptible, and more to the point, perceptible enough to be a hindrance to your workflow. So for example, for the hybrid orchestral with a master plus slave setup, at 48 and 64 buffer sizes, absolutely the dropouts were perceptible, they were constant, they were a major hindrance to getting anything done, so you would never run at those buffer sizes. Contrary to that, at 128 and 256 buffer sizes, dropouts definitely were not perceptible. So yes, they occurred maybe once a minute, once every 2 minutes, but they were not significant enough to have any kind of impact on my workflow. Now the story changed a bit at the 96 buffer size, where there definitely were some perceptible dropouts, but in general, they weren't significant enough to alter my workflow. So you could keep working through it. It certainly wasn't ideal. They might get a little annoying after a while, but if you're under a deadline, you're in a pinch, you got to get something done, you could certainly make it work. So that's what's indicated by the sum label in these tables here. For the pop EDM track, the story is very much the same, where at 96 buffer, there were some perceptible dropouts that might cause a hindrance to your workflow. 128, 256, both perfectly fine, no issues, and 64 and 48, absolutely no way you'd run that project at either of those buffer sizes. And then for the hybrid orchestral setup on a single machine, the results were different there because the unworkable range extended all the way into the 96 buffer size and part of the 128 buffer size. And again, this is where we did see that some practical advantage exists for number of cores. As you move from 6 cores to 8 cores at the 128 buffer size on this project, you went from absolutely unworkable to, yes, maybe I can make it work. But again, the truth is, you probably just bump the buffer size up to 256, at which point the distinction between 4 cores and 14 cores disappears. And that, I think, is the key takeaway from these tests. It's pretty hard for me to say there's a practical difference between 6 or 8 cores and 14 cores. Yes, I did see a bit of a practical advantage going from 6 cores to 8 cores when I tried to run all of that massive project from one machine. But again, you could just bump the buffer size up to 256, which is still a perfectly workable buffer size. And the latency associated with a buffer of 256 is still much lower than the latencies you get with acoustic instruments that people have been playing for millennia. So again, from a practical standpoint, I think 6 or 8 cores is about all you need to run a collection of virtual instruments within a digital audio workstation. Hopefully you've gotten some useful information out of this video. I've wanted to do this kind of test for a while now because as I've gone through the last several cycles of CPU upgrades, going from 4 cores to 6 cores to 10 cores to 14 cores, I really haven't seen much of a difference in terms of my overall workflow. I still run at the same basic minimum latency. I still experience the same basic number of dropouts for a given project type. So I really wasn't seeing any difference as I increased my core count. And I think those results are borne out within the tests that I've shown here in this video. So again, I'll throw in the caveat that perhaps it is specific to Windows. I'd be curious to know if anyone else has a different experience on Mac. Perhaps it is specific to Cubase. Maybe if you run an Ableton or some other DAW, the number of cores is more of a factor. But certainly from my perspective, for the types of projects that I've shown within this video, and for the setup that I'm running, I really haven't seen much of an advantage for number of cores. So if you're shopping for a new CPU for a digital audio workstation, make sure you keep that in mind.
Все еще не готово.
Hey folks, Richard Ames here again with another video on digital audio workstation performance. And today I'm going to be discussing one of the most misunderstood elements of DAW performance, and that's the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. I've encountered countless numbers of folks who say something along the lines of, I just got this dual Xeon Beast machine with 16 cores per processor and it's off the charts on the CPU benchmarks, but my buddy's measly 4-core i7 can run more virtual instruments at lower latency and with more plugins across the entire project. How can that possibly be? Well, the answer lies in the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. Rest assured that that dual Xeon Beast machine does indeed have significantly more CPU power than that 4-core i7. However, for DAW use, it's almost always the case that the real-time performance dictates the overall system performance. So if that dual Xeon Beast machine has poor real-time performance, no amount of CPU power is going to make it function well as a digital audio workstation. So, what precisely is the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance? Let's start to answer that question with something that every DAW user does on a regular basis, exporting audio. Here's a typical track that uses full orchestra through VE Pro over Ethernet. It's got a few synths, a full string section, some woodwinds, full brass section, a bunch of percussion. And this track will play just fine at a buffer setting of 128 samples. There you go, I'm using a Fireface with a buffer size of 128 samples. It'll play just fine with that buffer setting over the entire length of the track. So I'll start to play back here, and you can hear that indeed, no audio artifacts, no pops, no crackles. It's chugging along just fine. No issues down here in the VST performance meter. Now, let me go ahead and re-enable this limiter. And there you hear the crackles. So this limiter is pushing the computer beyond its capability to handle the audio for playback. But here's the first hint that the CPU is not the limiting factor. If you look down here at the Windows performance meter, I'm really never getting much above 50% or so. So that's telling me that my CPU is mostly just sitting around doing nothing. So it sure seems like an unlikely cause of the crackles. So here's an even better way to show that the CPU is not the limiting factor. Let's stop the playback for a second. And what I'm going to do is an audio export. So I'll pull up the export dialog box. I'll save it to some bogus file name. And what I'll also do is when the export starts is I'll start this stopwatch down here. And we'll see how long this takes. So let's start the export. Yep, I've done it once before, so let me overwrite that. And once it gets going, we'll go ahead and start the timer here. Now what I'll do at this point is I'll pause the video and then bring you back in when the export process is done. Okay, this 3-minute and 33-second track took about 2 minutes and 48 seconds to export. Now keep in mind that while I was doing this export, I had the screen capture and a separate audio capture process running in the background. So the computer's working a lot harder than it normally would have to. And without these extra burdens, it actually takes about 2 minutes and 27 seconds to export this 3-minute and 33-second track. Now let's think about this for a second. The computer can't keep up with the audio over the course of a 3.5-minute track when playing it back. However, it can process all of the exact same audio and write it to disk in significantly less than 3.5 minutes. How can that be? If the CPU is sufficiently powerful to do all of the audio processing in much less than 3.5 minutes, then if you give it 3.5 minutes, it's got more time, so playing it back should be a much easier task, right? Well, no. And the reason is that playback is a real-time process and writing to disk is a non-real-time process, and they're two very different elements of computer performance. If I were to double or triple my CPU power in this example, I might write to disk more quickly, but clearly I'm not going to impact the real-time playback because my CPU is already more than sufficiently powerful to process all of the data much faster than is required for the playback. So, if you're able to export audio faster than real-time, you're probably not CPU limited. You have plenty of processing power available to do all of the audio processing much faster than is required in real time, but you can't do it in real time. Let's dig a bit deeper to understand why that is. The CPU has a number of devices for which it must provide processing power. In this example, I'm showing a hard disk, a monitor hooked up via a video card, and some USB devices. And of course, in reality, the CPU has many more devices and processes that it has to deal with, but let's use these three as an example. When one of these devices needs the CPU, it interrupts the processor with a request for processing. And while the CPU responds to this request for processing, it is locked up by the device to which it is responding. Sometimes, even if the computer has provided all the necessary processing for the device, some devices continue to lock up the CPU so that it's not able to respond to other processing requests. This is why your CPU is rarely anywhere near 100% usage. It spends a lot of time waiting for something else to happen. Now, the lockup problem has little to do with CPU power. It's determined almost entirely by the device causing the lockup, but it does determine the overall responsiveness of the system. That's the essence of the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. You can have an infinitely powerful CPU, but if it's locked up by some device, then it can't respond to other devices, and the system will perform poorly, even though there's plenty of CPU power available. Okay, so real-time performance and CPU performance are affected by different elements of the system, and they affect the overall system performance in different ways. Why is it that real-time performance is so much more important for digital audio workstation use than, say, video editing or working on a spreadsheet? Those activities use the same system, but they don't seem to have any issues with real-time performance. Why not? The answer is in the difference in the response times required for those different activities. Unlike a video editor or spreadsheet or web browser, a digital audio workstation has to continually process data in near real time because it's taking inputs from external MIDI and audio devices and processing them on the way back out to the monitors, often while also playing back audio that was previously recorded. If you hit the keys on your MIDI keyboard and it takes 100 milliseconds for the sound to come out of the monitors, that's very disconcerting and you're going to record a bad take. In a video editor or spreadsheet, however, the user input and resulting actions are often separated by hundreds or even thousands of milliseconds with no impact on workflow. In fact, in a video editor, the user input is almost always entirely separate from the playback. You make some tweaks, then you view the playback. Then you make some more tweaks, then you view the playback. And if there's a delay of a couple hundred milliseconds from the time you finish the tweaks to the time you start the playback, you'll never notice it. Those same couple hundred milliseconds in a DAW, however, are very noticeable. And not only does it have to react faster than that couple of hundred milliseconds, it has to do so while also playing back the data that you've already recorded. In order to understand how this responsiveness is related to real-time performance, let's take a look at how audio gets from the DAW to your monitors. Your audio converter must continually provide output to your monitors, so it requires a continuous stream of digital audio data from the DAW. This audio is transferred in chunks of data at a time. The size of this chunk is called the audio buffer size and is set in your audio interface parameters. This buffer size is related to the responsiveness of the system because once the audio is moved into the buffer, it takes time to do the conversion. So there's a continual cycle of moving audio into the buffer and then waiting for the converter to produce the analog signal that is sent out to the monitors. While that conversion occurs, the next buffer must be filled. That cycle repeats over and over as the converter receives digital audio and converts it to the analog signal that goes to the monitors. Because the DAW needs to respond quickly, this buffer must be very tiny and therefore refilled very often because the DAW can fill only one buffer at a time. The smaller the buffer size, the more responsive the system. However, the smaller the buffer, the more efficient the other elements of the system must be in order to ensure that the CPU isn't locked up for too long. That's why DAW performance is much more affected by real-time performance than most other applications. The buffers for DAW use drive the system to extremely quick response times, much faster than those required for most other processing tasks. Let's bring back our other devices and see how they affect the audio buffer transfers. When the devices in the system have good real-time performance, there are no lockups that prevent the CPU from processing the audio data and filling the buffer at the required interval. So the processor is able to attend to the processing requirements for all elements of the system and keep the audio buffer filled so that there's a constant stream of audio data going to the audio converter. When a problem device locks up the CPU, however, the CPU can't fill the audio buffer, and the audio data stream has a gap in it, or worse, a garbled mess of random data. Of course, the audio converter doesn't know what's in the buffer, so it dutifully converts the garbage digital data into garbage analog data that produces garbage sound from your monitors. Those are the pops, clicks, and crackles that you hear. Sometimes, though, the computer just puts everything on pause until the buffer is filled. In that case, you hear and see a stutter. Either way, there's a break in the audio stream that you hear because the buffer wasn't filled in time. As we already demonstrated, the CPU is more than powerful enough to do all the audio processing faster than is required for real-time playback. The break in the audio stream is not because the CPU can't keep up, it's because it's locked up by some other device. So even if we were to put in a more powerful processor, we likely wouldn't see any reduction in the number of audio crackles because the CPU is not the bottleneck. Now, I say likely because it is possible that the CPU is not powerful enough to deal with the processing requirements of one of the devices, but as of about 5 to 7 years ago, that almost never happens. It's the device itself that causes the lockup, not the lack of CPU power. So what about the guy who upgrades his computer to one with a more powerful CPU and sees his audio problems go away? Well, if the only element he changed was the CPU, then in fact, yes, he probably was having CPU problems. But that's almost never the case. Most folks, when they get a new CPU, they also get at least a new motherboard, and more likely an entirely new computer. Well, if you replace either one of those components, then you've got new links to the disk system, new links to the USB system, new links to the video system, new links to all of these other systems that are potential sources of real-time performance problems. So you can't say it was the CPU upgrade that improved the performance. Furthermore, lots of folks upgrade to a new computer with a more powerful processor and get worse DAW performance. If the new system has worse real-time performance than the old system, then it doesn't matter if the CPU is more powerful. It's not going to perform well as a digital audio workstation. So buyer beware. CPU benchmarks don't tell the whole story for DAW performance. You need to find somebody who's running the types of projects that you run, the right number of track counts, the same types of virtual instruments, the same types of plugins, at the same types of latencies. Only with those types of examples will you know for sure exactly how that new system is going to perform when you use it. Now let's take a look at a non-real-time process, like the audio export example, and compare it to a real-time process. There are two fundamental differences between real-time playback and non-real-time export. First, in the non-real-time export, there is no continuous audio stream. So the data can be written to disk as they become available, not according to a precisely timed interval as required by an audio interface. That allows the processor to work in the audio processing among all the other tasks it has to do. There's never a situation where it's going to miss a buffer transfer because, unlike the real-time process, the CPU has control of when the buffer transfer occurs. Second, the processor can provide however much data it wants in each chunk. So if you have a very powerful processor that can crunch a lot of data in a short period of time, then it will write to the disk a lot faster than a processor that is less powerful. In the real-time scenario, the processor can only provide a single buffer's worth of data for any given buffer period. It can't store them up for future buffer transfers. That's one of the major reasons why powerful processors are a big help for video rendering, but not so much help for DAW use. Here's an example of video rendering. As you can see, the CPU usage is extremely high, nearly 100% most of the time. Compare that to the real-time playback example at the start of this video, where the CPU usage rarely rose above 50%, even though we were getting crackles in the audio. In the real-time audio example, the CPU can provide no more than one buffer of data at a time, and it must do so at a precisely defined interval. So even if the CPU is not encumbered by other devices, it can't use its processing power to fill more buffers, so it spends a lot of time just sitting around. For the non-real-time video export, however, the CPU can fill as many buffers as it wants whenever it gets the chance. So the CPU spends a lot less time waiting for something else to happen. As a result, the average CPU usage is much higher, and the rendering performance is a strong function of the CPU performance. Now, let's compare the real-time and non-real-time processes to see how they differ. We'll look at both and count the number of buffers each one transfers as time progresses. Again, the real-time process must provide precisely one buffer of data at precisely the right interval. If it gets locked up by some other process, it can't catch up by crunching more data in the next time interval. That audio train has already left the station. The non-real-time transfer, on the other hand, can provide however much data it wants at whatever interval it wants. So even though there are periods of time where it falls behind, it can catch up by crunching a lot more data at a later time. So, on average over timescales of seconds or longer, the non-real-time process can crunch a lot more audio data than the real-time process. That's why the audio export takes less time than it takes to play back the entire track. There's plenty of CPU power there to crunch all of the audio data faster than is required for that real-time playback rate. However, if the CPU can't guarantee that it will provide each chunk of data at exactly the right time, then you'll hear pops and crackles and stutters, even though on average there's significantly more CPU power there than you need. That's also why increasing the audio buffer size helps solve a lot of audio problems. You're essentially increasing the window of opportunity that the CPU has to fill that audio buffer. That gives it more time to deal with potential lockups from other devices within the system. So, for DAW use, it's the responsiveness or real-time performance that is the